consequence of climate change, and it's growing. Tom Murphy breaks down the impact of not really knowing where the water will be going.
In a flash flood, you need to know where the safe ground is. Lives can depend on it.
Slow down, lad!
But last July in the Halifax area, even those you'd think would know struggled at times to find it. That's when a flood map would come in real handy, but good luck finding a decent one. Just ask Union Street's Zephaniah Otuki. In that same intense storm back in July, Otuki's home flooded in no time.
The flooding was right about here.
He saw a flood map about 15 years ago. How outdated it was, he doesn't know. It showed his house was in a floodplain, but he says there was nothing on the map to predict this kind of damage.
They're useless. For someone who has been affected like me, they're useless. The mapping has to be looked at in fresh light based on the climate situations today.
But when it comes to seeing flood maps, it turns out Otuki was fortunate because many residents never do. When semi-retired meteorologist Jim Abraham went to see the flood maps for the Sackville-Bedford area of Halifax just a few years ago, he was shocked.
I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement to look at the Halifax maps. They were nervous. They didn't want this to get out to the public.
Well, so what does that tell you, that you had to sign a non-disclosure agreement?
Well, I found it somewhat bizarre, but I wasn't surprised to sign a non-disclosure agreement with the insurance industry, but I was surprised to sign a non-disclosure agreement with the city of Halifax.
And fact is, most communities don't even have a flood map. Decades ago, it was the federal government's responsibility to produce them. But that got downloaded to the provinces and, in some cases, municipalities. The result, at best, Canada has a patchwork of flood maps where it has any at all.
It's not that you can't build on a floodplain, but if you do, you build with your eyes open.
Blair Feltmate at the Intact Centre of Climate Adaptation says some people would prefer to keep the public in the dark.
It's messaging people don't want to hear, because their house may now be in an area that previously they thought was high and dry and free of flooding, but now it's been stigmatized or it's been red tagged into a zone vulnerable for flooding, which obviously has an impact of devaluation on property, amongst other points, and it's almost news that people don't want to hear.
I have an estimate of about 60,000 to try and rebuild it, but everything is gone.
All the while, development continues, which is what really bothers Otuki. After he bought his house, the city permitted hundreds of new homes to be built higher up the hill from his house, land that would have normally helped absorb floodwaters.
So many things have changed. So many buildings have come up here. The roads and so on have never been upgraded.
Which is the argument being made in many cities across Canada, including in Oakville, Ontario. There, residents launched a class action lawsuit claiming excessive development put their homes at risk.
Putting your head in the sand and trying to ignore the problem is not the way to go. Yeah, if you went back 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, I think, municipalities could legitimately claim, we really didn't understand. But today, in terms of going forward in reference to developments, there can be no claim that we didn't know. If you didn't know, you should have known.
The federal government is now spending $164 million on floodplain mapping for high-risk areas over the next 5 years. But critics say promises have been made before.
Well, Canada's been talking about bringing flood risk maps up to date for probably 15 or 20 years. Nonetheless, the flood risk maps on average for the country remain about 20 to 25 years out of date.
At this stage, it's a mess.
Parts of Halifax, the Bedford-Sackville area in particular, did do improved flood mapping in recent years, and those maps are now public. Jim Abraham says it's a start at least.
But if we do have, or when we do have those kind of detailed flood maps, emergency managers are going to know where the areas that are most at risk of flooding, what roads are most at risk of flooding, And then if there are evacuations that are required or roads that need to be closed, you can do that as quick as possible to mitigate the kind of risk that's associated with a flash flood.
Bro, that's crazy.
In Halifax's recent flash flood, not one but two fire trucks were partially submerged. And what's more tragic, 4 people in another community were swept to their deaths trying to flee their homes. Would flood mapping have saved them? There's no telling. But with climate change increasing, experts insist better maps will save lives in the future.
And as Tom Murphy has told us, you know who does have good flood maps? Insurance companies. They've invested heavily over the years to help decide which properties are too risky to insure. The industry is now working with the federal government to come up with flood zone maps that will be made public. Coming up.